A desperate pounding shattered the velvet darkness of Buckingham Palace. In the echoing corridors, where whispers became the stuff of history, the fists of the most powerful woman in the world hammered against an oak bedroom door. She demanded, pleaded, commanded to be let in, for behind that door lay the center of her universe, her husband, her Albert. The thought of a cold, empty bed was not merely unpleasant to her. It was physically unbearable, an icy draft seeping into her very soul. This was not the mere whim of a capricious queen. It was the cry of a soul that would tolerate no barrier between herself and her greatest passion. We think we know her, the stern widow in perpetual mourning, the symbol of an entire era, a prim icon of morality. But this is just a facade, a cardboard cutout hiding a drama of fire and insatiable hunger, a hunger for life in all its forms, from the fevered intimacy of her beloved husband's arms to a plate of steaming curry and a mountain of cakes. This is not the story of the queen on the postcards, but of a woman whose appetites would have shocked her subjects to their core. We will descend into the darkest corners of her past to find the key to her great secret, and you will learn the truth untold in textbooks. The story of how a hungry child, locked in a golden cage, grew up to devour the world. To understand the origins of this all-consuming appetite, we must journey back in time to the quiet, cold halls of Kensington Palace. Here, far from prying eyes, a drama unfolded that would forge the future queen's character. Her childhood was no princess's fairy tale, but a harsh story of survival in a gilded prison. The architects of this prison were two people: her own mother, the Duchess of Kent, and the sinister figure who perpetually lurked behind her, Sir John Conroy. Together, they created what history would come to call by a chilling name, the Kensington System. It was not simply an educational method, but a total program for suppressing her will, designed with a single, cynical goal: to keep the girl weak, dependent, and utterly unprepared for power. The calculation was simple. When young Victoria ascended the throne, she would be a pliable puppet in the hands of her mother and her mother's domineering favorite, who would rule the country in her name. Conroy, whom Victoria would come to hate with a force known only to a soul that has endured tyranny, was the true gray eminence of this small court, and his shadow fell across every day of her young life. Every aspect of the princess's existence was subject to iron routine and sleepless surveillance. She was never alone, not for a single minute. Even walking down a palace staircase, she was required to hold someone's hand. Her bedroom was also her mother's. There was no question of personal space, no possibility of having secrets of her own. The all-seeing eye of the system monitored her every step, every word, every breath. Friends? She had none. Her only companions were a collection of over 100 dolls and her beloved spaniel, Dash. Any meetings with outsiders, even relatives, took place only in the presence of the Duchess or Conroy. The girl was deliberately isolated from the world, turning the palace into a hermetically sealed vessel, where she was expected to mature like an exotic but spineless flower. But the most sophisticated tool of this system of control, the most painful and humiliating, was her diet. Hunger became her constant companion. While the world around her lived fully, the future ruler of the British Empire might dine on a cup of milk and a single slice of dry bread. Sweets, that small symbol of childhood happiness, appeared on the table only on the grandest of occasions. Even a simple spoonful of jam with her tea was considered an unforgivable luxury. This chronic imposed hunger was not merely a physical deprivation. It became a powerful psychological anchor, a symbol of her utter powerlessness. Every pang of hunger reminded her that she was not even the master of her own body. Food became synonymous with freedom, power, and independence, everything she was so systematically denied. It was then, in the silence of her rooms, tormented by hunger and loneliness, that young Victoria made a vow. It was the quiet but unbreakable oath of a child who promised herself she would have revenge for every humiliation. She swore that when she grew up, when she was queen, she would eat mutton every single day, and no one ever again would dare tell her what to put on her plate. This gastronomic rebellion, born in the twilight of Kensington, became her life's mission. So, when the news of King William IV's death made her queen in June 1837, one of her very first acts of independence was to order her bed moved out of her mother's bedroom. The shackles of control were broken, and with them, all dietary restrictions were shattered. The girl who had dreamed of a piece of mutton now had all the kitchens and cellars of the greatest empire in the world at her command, and she had no intention of denying herself anything. The prison of Kensington was behind her, replaced by the vast larder of the British Empire. The royal kitchens, which had operated for decades at a measured pace, suddenly began to seethe like a roused volcano. Chefs, confectioners, and wine butlers scrambled to satisfy the appetites of their new mistress. For Victoria, food was no longer just about sating hunger. It was a daily ritual of asserting her power. She was making up for lost time with a fury and flair that turned every meal into a grand spectacle, starring herself, the queen who could finally eat whatever she wanted in any quantity she desired. Her days were no longer governed by the strict timetable of her wardens, but by a succession of gastronomic pleasures that followed one another with relentless regularity. The traditional breakfast, lunch, and dinner were merely the tip of the iceberg. In between, like precious jewels, were numerous afternoon teas and snacks, each of which could have served as a full meal for an ordinary person. The Queen's breakfast was a declaration of intent. The table was laid with porridge, several kinds of fish, eggs on toast, and a special type of smoked haddock, known as finnan haddie. Of course, she didn't eat it all. The most important thing for her was the choice itself, the ability to survey a table laden with delicacies and take exactly what she craved at that moment. This was a luxury the hungry girl from her past could not have even dreamed of. Dinner was an equally impressive spectacle. It might begin with soup, followed by fish, then cold boiled chicken or a succulent roast beef. And of course, there was always dessert and fruit, including pineapples grown in special hothouses exclusively for the royal court. Victoria had a particular weakness for simple seasonal vegetables, and her love of potatoes became legendary. Courtiers noted that her chefs prepared potatoes for her in every conceivable way, and this simple, earthy passion made her image all the more contradictory and alive. But the Queen's appetites were not limited to traditional English cuisine. Her position allowed her to sample the most exotic dishes delivered to England from the farthest reaches of her vast empire. One of her favorite delicacies was green turtle soup, an expensive and rare dish that became a symbol of colonial luxury. And from her Indian dominions came another passion, spicy curry, which by her command was prepared daily. She savored these overseas flavors as if she were tasting her dominions, feeling the power and diversity of the world that lay at her feet. And if the queen had to travel, an old fear would awaken in her soul. The anxiety that she might be poorly fed, that she might once again experience that forgotten feeling of hunger, was so strong that she would order entire baskets of food to take with her. This small, almost comical detail speaks volumes about the depth of her childhood trauma. The queen of a great empire traveled to visit friends with her own sandwiches, ham, and pies, like a common traveler terrified of going without supper. And yet, Victoria's true, all-consuming passion was for sweets. Here, her appetite knew absolutely no bounds. Mulled wine, ice cream, cakes, pies, and pastries of every kind were constantly at her disposal. One courtier, who left anonymous memoirs, listed the queen's dessert arsenal with reverent horror. Chocolate biscuits, plain biscuits, wafers of 2 or 3 different shapes, langue de chat, gingerbread, shortbread, pralines, almond sweets, and a large variety of mixed sweets. He added that Her Majesty adored all kinds of pies, and a cranberry tart with cream was one of her absolute favorites. Beverages also played a role in this feast. Tea, of course, held a place of honor, but in her later years, the Queen developed a new affection for Scotch whiskey. It was rumored that her faithful servant and close friend, John Brown, introduced her to the taste. A small distillery near Balmoral Castle even produced a special blend just for her, which she preferred to drink mixed with soda. Against this backdrop of gastronomic abundance, one fact is particularly striking. For her own children, the Queen was a strict dietitian. Every day, she personally reviewed the prince's and princess's menu and, with her own hand, circled in pencil the modest dishes they were permitted to eat. The woman who had created a perpetual feast for herself kept her heirs on the same short leash from which she herself had once escaped. But this endless feast had a dark side, a price the Queen paid with her own body. Nature had not blessed Victoria with the stature of a Greek goddess. She stood only 5 feet tall and had always been prone to gaining weight. In the early years of her reign, as a young, unmarried woman, she had to consider the opinions of the court and society. It reached a point where even her mentor and Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, once dared to tactfully suggest that Her Majesty was rapidly putting on weight. For the young Queen, who still had to find a husband and assert her authority, this remark was a cold shock. That time, she found the motivation and willpower to take control. She went on a diet and managed to lose the weight, restoring her girlish figure. But it was her first and last victory in the long war against her own appetite. The turning point was her marriage. In Prince Albert, she found not just a husband, but the center of her universe, and the need to meet anyone else's expectations vanished. Love and happiness became her best justification for any indulgence, and after love came children. 9 times her body endured the trial of pregnancy and childbirth. For Victoria, this was a difficult period, not only because of physical ailments, but also because of the enforced distance from her husband prescribed by doctors. Each pregnancy left its mark, and her once slender figure began to slowly but inexorably expand. As early as the 1840s, when she was just in her 20s, one perceptive doctor observed, "She is more like a barrel than anything else," predicting that if the Queen did not moderate her appetite, she would become an exceedingly stout lady. The prediction came true with terrifying accuracy. Gradually, Victoria grew larger. Soon, she abandoned the corset altogether, that symbol of the Victorian era and the primary tool for maintaining a respectable figure. Contemporaries described her as very large, florid, and fat. She transformed into a massive matron whose image did not align with romantic notions of queenship. By her 60s, by modern medical standards, she would have been diagnosed with severe obesity. Her body had become a living testament to her rebellion against all limitations, both external and internal. When concerned doctors advised her to reduce her food intake, she found a solution that was brilliant in its absurdity. She began to eat newfangled diet foods, but not instead of her usual meals, but in addition to them. By the end of her life, this petite woman's weight, by some estimates, approached 130 kilograms, around 280 pounds. Her body had become a fortress built of pies and roast beef, protecting her from the ghosts of her hungry childhood. But even the thickest walls could not save her from the blow that fate had in store. In December 1861, Queen Victoria's world collapsed. The pillar that supported her entire universe, her reason, her happiness, and her will, crumbled to dust. Her Albert was gone. For her, this tragedy was not merely the loss of a beloved husband. It was the eclipse of the sun, the end of the music, the finale of life itself. The insatiable hunger for existence, which she had satisfied in his embrace and at her table, lost all meaning. Only one appetite remained, the oldest and simplest, the appetite for food, which now blazed with the force of a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. If food had once been a celebration and an assertion of power, it now became the only medicine for unbearable pain, a way to fill the gaping void in her soul. Control was lost completely and irrevocably. All concern for her appearance, all notion of restraint, was cast aside along with the mourning crepe she would wear for the rest of her days. Her grief was immeasurable, and her body became its physical reflection. She ate copiously, constantly, almost mechanically, as if trying to crush the sorrow bursting from within under the sheer weight of her own body. The same courtiers who had once admired her love of life now watched in horror at her transformation. Descriptions of her figure from this period are filled with undisguised shock. She became colossal, ponderous, a living monument to her grief. Her body, weighed down by decades of feasting and now flooded by a wave of tragedy, had finally overflowed its banks. It was during this period that the full depth of her psychological drama was revealed. Doctors, at the risk of incurring the monarch's wrath, begged her to be prudent, warning of the consequences for her health, and Victoria, to some extent, even listened. She agreed to try newfangled diet biscuits and patented weight loss products. But in her grief-distorted mind, this worked in a paradoxical way. She would eat a recommended diet cracker and then, as if having fulfilled her duty to medicine, would proceed with a clear conscience to her usual gargantuan meal. It was a desperate and, in its futility, touching attempt at self-deception, where the diet became just another course in her endless menu. The fortress of food she had so painstakingly built all her life to protect herself from the ghosts of a hungry past had now become her prison, where she locked herself away with her grief, the keys forever lost. To fully grasp the scale of Queen Victoria's personal rebellion, one must look at the era that bears her name. Victorian society was built on rigid rules, unwritten laws, and the strictest code of propriety, especially when it came to women. A Victorian lady was expected to be an ethereal creature, an almost bodiless angel whose physical needs were reduced to a minimum. This applied to everything, but above all, to food. A healthy appetite in a woman was considered a sign of poor taste, licentiousness, and even a certain animalistic coarseness. The ideal lady was supposed to peck like a bird, delicately nibbling tiny morsels and leaving most of the food on her plate. To show hunger was tantamount to showing other, far more reprehensible desires. The doctors of the time, being products of their era, provided a pseudo-scientific basis for this social norm. They seriously argued that rich food could overstimulate a woman's fragile nervous system, making her overly emotional, hysterical, and prone to improper conduct. Thus, diet became a tool not only of aesthetic, but also of moral control. By restricting a woman's food, society restricted her expression of any strong feelings, forcing her life energy into the Procrustean bed of social expectations. A young woman who ate with pleasure risked being deemed intemperate and ill-bred, which could ruin her reputation and her chances of a good marriage. For a woman, a meal was not a pleasure, but a test to be passed with dignity and maximum restraint. And there, against this backdrop of theatrical starvation, at the very pinnacle of this social pyramid, sat Queen Victoria, a woman whose appetite could rival that of an entire regiment. Her status was an absolute shield, an impenetrable armor that allowed her to ignore any and all norms. She was not just a woman, she was the queen, and her desires were law. No one dared reproach her for her lack of restraint. No one could accuse her of poor taste. She ate openly, with relish, never hiding her pleasure, and in doing so, perhaps without even realizing it, she threw down a challenge to the entire hypocritical morality of her age. Her ample body, her passion for roast beef and cranberry tart, was a silent but deafening manifesto. It was a rebellion not against a diet, but against the very idea that a woman should be less than a man, that her desires should be more modest and her portions smaller. In a world where women were instructed to be incorporeal shadows, Queen Victoria was the embodiment of life itself, loud, greedy, imperfect, and utterly real. And in that, perhaps, lies her greatest unspoken legacy.